We're back with our socially distant studio visit number 23 in a series we've been doing for Hallwall's Contemporary Art Center, talking to artists from Hallwall's history across the country and across the continent to see how they're doing during these weird pandemic times, what they're doing, and how things are with them wherever they are. And today we're talking to Buffalo artist Bruce Adams, who, like a couple other people I've spoken to, is probably about a mile or so away from me right now. Although, you know, distance is a relative thing these days. So my first question, Bruce, as with everyone, is how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I've been doing okay, really, during the pandemic. I don't know if you want me to expand on how are you, but
well, I mean, your mental and physical health has been fine.
Okay, yeah, mental and physical health. So, initially, I was losing weight where other people were claiming they were gaining weight or saying they were gaining weight, because I found I wasn't eating as many meals in my car. I'm always, rushing from one thing to another normally, and I often grab food and eat it in the car, and it's usually the worst kind of food. And sometimes I think I do a kind of comfort eating where I tell myself, you don't really want to go to this, but if you go, I will buy you a donut. So it gets me out of the door, and that wasn't happening. And so I was kind of losing a little weight, but I think that's sort of evened out now. And it's been mentally tedious, but I've been doing fairly well. I'm handling it well. I'm like all people, I'm anxious to get back to the real world, and a little concerned sometimes that it seems like it will never really happen entirely, and wondering how that's going to play out. But generally
in terms of how things have played out, you're a lifelong Buffalo resident, so you know this community as well as anyone. What's been your perception of how Buffalo has handled things? I don't mean epidemiologically, I mean socially and whatnot during the past 2 months of quarantine.
Well, of course, I'm sure this is true of other cities. In fact, I know it is. There's been an effort to switch to online ways of presenting art, which a lot of us, I'm sure, and I'm one, feel it's not quite as satisfying, not even close to as satisfying as the real thing. So there's been that. I don't know. It feels like you're looking at everything through Vaseline coated glass. It's like it's there, but there's a distance. I mean, literally, we talk about social distancing, so there's that. But there's a distance in, I'm going to call it in tone, between people. I've also been kind of disturbed by the amount of, I'll call it animosity that social media has generated. Now, it's hard for me sometimes to separate the general population from the art community because so many of the people I communicate with are connected some way or another to the art community. But I think tensions are running high on Facebook, and there's a lot of finger pointing and tisking going on that I find frustrating and difficult. And I actually think there are going to have to be some friendships repaired after the pandemic ends and people get to see each other in person. I think I've mentioned this before. Well, I've written about this before, that being on social media is a bit like being behind the wheel of a car, where you're isolated from other drivers and you behave in ways that you might not behave face to face. And I've seen some of that I find really disturbing. So I guess that sums up my feelings about the social aspects of Buffalo.
Well, let's get back to a different social aspect because, as you mentioned, we're part of an art community, and a big part of an art community is congregating together around openings and other events. And certainly you're in the category of cultural participants that tries very hard to go to most openings, if not all openings. And it's almost impossible to see you at an opening not engaged in a conversation with someone. And so I'm wondering, how much are you missing that specific activity right about now?
No, that's the big thing. Of course, I enjoy seeing art. That's obvious. But I definitely, that's what feels like what's gone out of my life. Because in most respects, my life hasn't dramatically changed. I think we'll talk about that in a bit. But in that one respect, rarely does a week go by that there isn't some social activity surrounding the art community, involving the art community. And suddenly that's gone. And it's, at first, I think maybe at first it was a little bit of a, I'm going to say something kind of counter to what you would expect. It was almost a little relief at first, because sometimes making an effort to get to every art show and other kind of social event around the art community is sort of difficult. And I don't get to all of them. I miss a lot because it can be really tiring. It can be intense. And so suddenly there was this like enforced vacation, and it felt good for a short time. And then very quickly I started missing it. And it just feels like there's a hole in my life, and I'm just conscious of that hole all the time.
I didn't mention, but for many years, you were a teacher in the public school system, an art teacher, and you retired a few years ago. And then just before this past semester, retired from Buffalo State College. And so you kind of dodged the bullet of remote teaching, but I wonder if you had any, having been an art teacher for so long, if you had any thoughts about the implications and the problems and the challenges of remote teaching for your colleagues that are still doing it.
Well, I did dodge a bullet, and I'm really grateful for that. I was always technologically willing to, you can't be technologically willing to be technologically forward thinking. And so I already had set up all my courses on an online program that we use at school at Buff State. And I put all of my materials on that, and students could access that material. But I have to say, I know that a lot of the teachers went through a real difficult transition trying to adapt. And I'm very confident that students did not get the same quality of education online as they would have in person. So I guess my thought is that it's valuable to have the opportunity to present things online. So for instance, in my class, when students couldn't make it to class for one reason, or didn't make it to class for one reason or another, the materials were there. But I would always say, like, it's not the same as going over them in class and having that that discussion, that exchange of ideas that you would have in a real classroom. So I guess my thought is that it can be done, and it is being done, but I can't imagine it being as effective as teaching in a classroom. But it seems like it might happen more and more in the future. And I think this semester teachers really had to, and I'm thinking of public school teachers and college professors, really had to quickly adapt to a different world, and that had to be very hard. I was just really glad. Even though I was advanced, I could have just said, "Look, my course is already online," and made some adaptations. It still would have been really difficult, and especially with art, because now you're having to judge artwork through online images, and we all know we use those all the time, but they're not the same as seeing it in life. So
Yeah,
that's
I think the latter that I was most interested in terms of this question, which is anytime you're teaching drawing, painting, sculpture, anything materially based, where you want to be in the same space as your student and give them feedback and show them things in person.
yeah,
That is really compromised when it
right.
moves to a remote scenario.
When you're teaching painting, for instance, you're being tugged by students who are saying, "Come here, show me, tell me, what am I doing, tell me." And you're almost like a bee going from plant to plant, pollinating their paintings, um, with your thoughts. And how that gets done online, it's more like, I mean, you could probably tell students to submit things in progress, and you could offer some comments. And you can imagine, you look at art all the time. You can imagine trying to look at it online and be very specific about subtle things they might need to do. I think it would be very hard. So you end up kind of, they're a little bit more on their own. And of course, I'm just speculating because I got out of it before it happened. But with my limited experience doing that kind of thing online, where students had maybe turned in things in the past online because they became ill at the end of the year or something, it's very difficult. So I don't know how they got through it.
I mean, I do look at things electronically, as you say, but the difference is, as a curator, I'm looking at people that are working as professional artists that are done with their schooling, and they're showing me resolved pieces or submitting work for consideration. That's a whole lot different than, trying to steer someone in real time in terms of what they're creating.
And even then, I imagine you've had the experience where something looked good online, and then you got it, and it in the gallery or whatever, and it wasn't what you imagined. Would you say that's happened?
Not as much as you would think. I think people that are serious about their artwork, no matter what they're making, tend to nowadays, because they have the capacity and the technology, tend to document things very well. So as long as you have all the information and it's documented well, there's always a difference. I mean, I would always rather see something in person, to be sure. But Hall Walls has online submissions because you can discern a lot from the way things are presented. You and I, we had a plan to go to the Everson Museum in Syracuse just before COVID-19 rode in on a pale horse, and we were lucky enough to get out of town to the Akron Art Museum just shortly before the pandemic struck, and I kind of missed those art trips. What have you occupied most of your time with during quarantine?
Well, I think, what's that phrase? Something hates a vacuum. I forgot the phrase. I'm
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Abhors a vacuum. That's it. I knew I was almost, it was on the tip of my tongue. And I think that's, I do a number of things. I write, and I'm an artist, and I'm sitting in my garden right now because usually spring ends up being a sort of intense gardening time. I own more than one property that I have to maintain. So it's kind of like when certain things were eliminated because of the pandemic and the quarantine, other things rushed in to fill the void. And so perhaps I spent a little more time writing. I actually got to, initially especially, got to the studio maybe more than I had been just prior to it. There were jobs around the house that had gone undone for a long time that I finally got to. So I guess basically, stuff that I already do just expanded to fill the space that was empty from other things. That's the best way to describe it. Oh, and also, like many people, I'm watching more TV.
So you say you got to the studio more once the quarantine started, but how is it now? Are you, because you're pretty diligent among artists that I know about getting to the studio during the week and spending enough time there on your work. And there's a detail of one of your recent paintings behind my head right now. Has this moment opened up more studio time, or how's
Like
it
I
going
said,
now?
when the weather warms up in the spring, I always have to pull back a little bit from the studio to attend to our garden around our house. It's kind of like, it's demanding. It says it's you have to do it now. So in the last couple of weeks, that's what's been happening. I've been spending more time at home working on that. And then we did have the proximity project, which was a diversion in itself. And I know we'll talk about that. That kind of pulled me away from my regular studio practice, but still making art. So just very recently, there's been a little gap, but I'll be back to it, I would think, in the next couple of days.
Yeah, you mentioned proximity. So that was a sort of a citywide project organized by Emily Tucker and Elizabeth Samuels from Resource Art. And what can you tell us about that and your participation in it?
Well, it was inspired by the people in, I think it was Italy and some other cities. Italy began with people singing from balconies. I'm sure you saw that in the news. And then in some other cities, trying to think where. Well, New York, for one, artists were invited to do works that would be suspended from balconies that the public could see from a distance, from a safe distance. So they got that idea, and they put out an open call to artists to propose porch or lawn installations, and it was a fairly tight window. It seems like it was about 2 weeks. I know I let it sit for a week, thinking that, there's got to be time, and then I looked at it and I said, oh my God, I have to get this in quick. So so I came up with an idea, and a part of the idea was to use stuff at hand. Some of the artists could not get to their studios. So what did they have, around the house that they could use for an installation? And there was no real guidelines in terms of what it should be. In my case, I happened to have 2 mannequins that I had purchased for an earlier installation at Playground, which was another event by Resource Art. And I had recently, I'd acquired these globes that I think covered lights somewhere in an industrial setting. They're plastic, and they're all scuffed up, and they struck me as looking like those classic 1950s sci-fi space helmets, but they needed some work. So I polished them, and I put a rim around the opening so it looked like a collar. And I just wanted to do that, and I knew that I was going to use them for something, but I didn't know what. And then this thing came up, and it occurred to me to put those on the mannequins and put them on my porch and make a comment on the whole pandemic and the idea of staying safe. So I ended up putting them 6 feet apart with a sculptural element that was basically a crooked arrow that was 6 feet long, and then a painting in the middle that said "Stay safe." And that was up for, well, initially it was a week, and then they extended it for a little bit longer. And so that just ended, about a week ago.
It's kind of interesting because social commentary is not necessarily at the core of your work. But I do kind of wonder, or I'm curious whether there are, well, actually there's a space guy behind me with a globe, just like you just described.
Yeah, I know, what a coincidence.
I am curious whether there are images or ideas from this pandemic or quarantine that you could see sort of filtering into your work, because your work usually has a congregation of lots of imagery. And, I just wonder if the time we're living through will affect any of your work going forward.
I'm wondering that too. Seriously. First of all, I want to respond to something you said, that my work doesn't have a lot of social commentary. I actually think it does, but it might be just more subtle, less obvious than some kinds of work that, very clearly address various social issues.
I was going to say it's not the bailiwick of your work.
Yeah, I guess
it's in there. It's not the first thing I think of when I'm looking at your work.
Well, but maybe that's good. Maybe people should react to other things and then be drawn in, and then discover that there's commentary there. But there is. Anyway, we won't get into that. So the real question is, will this whole experience find its way into my work? And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I actually don't think it will too obviously, because I think the work will become very quickly dated. I think, people who do kind of temporary installations, it's perfect because they can comment on this and move on to something else. But people like me I also do that. But when I do my painting and it's over a long period of time, and the paintings are intended to exist over a long period of time, I don't want them to be tied so obviously to a period. So I guess the question becomes, will it in some psychological way filter its way into my work? And that's the part I've been trying to figure out. I've been wondering if and how the impact of this will change the tone of my work or the direction in some way. And I'm kind of thinking it won't, but I don't know. It's hard to say. I was driving along recently with my wife, and I mentioned to her that a prediction that sometime from now, I'm not sure, maybe a year or 2 years from now, we're not going to be able to remember how this felt. It seems so intense now, but it's going to diminish as we open things up, and sooner or later, life will go back to some kind of normal, and we won't remember these intense emotions we feel. I think they'll be gone, or they'll be, buried. So I don't know that it'll have a lasting effect. Maybe that's optimism.
Well, I'm fully on board with your optimism. I optimistically look forward to the moment where you and I can get in a car again and go to a different city like Cleveland or Pittsburgh, and see a museum, which is, I miss doing that so ardently, because that was always it's always great to do that. And you're mentioning normal brings me to my last question, which is,
well, let me just react to what you just said, because something just dawned on me with those trips. I was talking earlier about how initially this was almost a relief. Same thing with, our field trips, as we call them. I'm often overwhelmed with the work I have. I'm often under extreme stress. I take on too much work, and I enjoy that work. I do, but I don't enjoy those moments of stress where things pile up. So every time it's usually you, suggest let's go to a museum, I have to find a way to make room for that, to make time for that. And then I'm really always glad I did, because it's like a break from the grind of everyday life. And so yeah, I really enjoy those myself as a departure, and a welcome departure from the grind of everyday life.
Well, and I love forcing the issue. And it was, a great example was going to Akron, just to the Akron Art Museum shortly before the pandemic, because the show we saw, Inner Worlds, was about video games and art. And it was a spectacular show.
I loved that show. It was great. I was amazed. And that was a long drive, right? How long is that?
That was about a 3-hour drive. But
yeah. People listening to this probably can't imagine. You drive like 3 hours, you go to a museum for a couple hours, and then you get in the car and drive 3 hours back. And we've done longer. We've done 4-hour ones. So
well, we drove to Jamestown to the Comedy Museum and spent 5 hours there inexplicably. And so
that's a comparatively short drive, but a long museum visit. And I would go back again.
So aside from field trips and putting aside whatever the new normal is, or whatever version of normal returns to us, what's something that you can't do now that might be one of the first things you want to do when normal returns?
Wow. I wish I'd have had time to think about that. We talked about it earlier. I really want to go to art shows physically, and excuse me, art openings with other people. And also, I just thought of this. I regularly invite people to come to my studio to visit. I think it's really valuable to have people come and look at your art, and they often bring pieces of their art, and we talk about it and we share ideas. I find that very valuable. And we can't do that. Like currently, I continue to go to my studio. I think we've established that, but it's in a building where there's mostly other businesses and that are closed, and it's very empty. And I have 2 studio partners that are not there at all. And so I go into this massive building that's just like a ghost town. It's like totally empty, and I'm isolated by myself. So I'm really looking forward to being able to invite people back in the studio and having those conversations, talking about art, things like that. Also, my current work, as you know, I use people, friends, as models who come to my studio and get photographed, and I'm caught up on all the backlog of images I have. So I kind of need more people to start coming again.
Well, I hope for your sake that begins real soon. I hope for our sake we'll be standing at an opening together real soon.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for taking some time out today to talk to us, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.